The same weekend that George Floyd was murdered by Officer Derek Chauvin in Minnesota, and protests were ignited all over the country and here in Chicago, a 3-story building, a few buildings down from ours, erupted in flames at 3 a.m. When Jeanette and I went to bed the evening before, our hearts were heavy and we wondered what would happen with the protests in our city. We were afraid for the protesters, and we were afraid for how violence might erupt in neighborhoods. You can imagine how terrifying it was when we awoke to violent pounding on our front door and our neighbors screaming for everyone to get out of the building. We had no idea what was going on, and we didn't want to open the door, and our neighbor had disappeared. When I looked out of our front window, there were people all along the street below, and sirens and police and fire vehicles everywhere. We quickly got dressed and grabbed the kitty carriers and filled backpacks with our computers, which tells you something about our values. I heard a bunch of noise from the back part of our building, and when I went to look out the back door, I saw a very confusing scene. There were people running in the alley, and I could see these momentary flashes of light, and I heard loud popping sounds, and I thought people were shooting. I got down and went to Jeanette and said I wasn't sure it was the best idea to leave the building. And then I went back to the front window to try to make sense of what I was seeing. I realized that the people on the street weren't afraid, but were simply looking at something. So I opened our front window and poked my head all the way out and saw that the street was completely closed off just at the end of the block. So I went again to the back of the house. I was careful, and I looked at the scene differently out the back door. And then I realized I saw a downed electrical wire, which was the flashing. I saw people running, but not so much in fear, just more of an urgency. And when I finally got the courage to look all the way out of the building, I saw the building that was on fire. Initially, I had wondered if it had been set on fire for some reason. And then when I saw people gathered around, I knew that couldn't be the case. After taking some time to see the scene for what it actually was, we realized we were safe in our own house because the fire was being handled. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night, but we knew the chaos had some order to it. I met the owners of the building the next day, and it turns out it was an electrical fire, and the timing was coincidental. In the midst of all of the things I don't know, which could fill a universe, there is something I know. Chaos, the experience of it and the theories of it and the reality of it, is one of the necessary ingredients in the gumbo I call hope. Without chaos, I would have a very difficult time having hope and living from a place of hope. Chaos is many things. It's a sudden fire erupting and changing lives in an instant. It's getting a diagnosis you didn't expect. It's having an entire city shut down in 2 days because of a fast-spreading disease. It's being locked down in a school because of an active shooter. It's a protest march that goes off course. It's a protest march blocked by police who are in full military gear, ready for action. It's a movement that brings in unexpected guests. It's a group of people, any group, who decides the rules or the laws make no sense and they'll create their own. For some people, it's as simple as Black Friday shopping. For some, it's as complex as growing up with an alcoholic parent or a sibling who is an addict. For others, it's the aftermath of a natural disaster. For some, it's the experience of a panic attack. For many, it's losing something or someone. It's an insurrection at the capital of a supposedly democratic nation. It's war. Chaos is non-stop energy that is beyond our ability to harness. Chaos is all of those things and more. At the Grownish Adult Group last Wednesday evening, we talked about how some of us seem to be addicted to chaos. We like the adrenaline, we like the problem solving, we like the focus it gives us, we like the energy needed and expended when we are in the midst of chaos. When I mentioned that one thing I know is that chaos is one of the necessary ingredients of hope for me, it's because of how chaos is a necessary part of being able to solve a problem or repair the harm or finish the task or make progress toward a goal. When chaos is present, many of us are able to use particular gifts we have to create a sense of order in the midst of it. Others of us use the chaos to establish or assert control. When chaos is whirling around us, there's a feeling that things must get better and they will get resolved, which means there's hope. Dr. Otis Moss III writes a chapter about chaos in his book, and he suggests that we consecrate our chaos. He writes this: "In the storm of chaos, lost in confusion and disorder, the question we must ask is not whether we are cursed. It's not whether the time has come to give up. The question is whether there might be some way to use the harsh, unpredictable winds and the relentless currents of our lives to get us moving to where we actually want to go. Do we have the spiritual audacity and the practical means to turn chaotic energy to our own purposes? When you take on the confusion and violence and you refine them, purify them into something new, you're doing what we call in the vocabulary of faith, consecrating your chaos. To consecrate it is to make holy, to put it in service for good. In consecrating chaos, you engage it, tame it, name it, take what seemed out of control and charge it with a duty. So, how is it that we harness the energy of chaos and use it to get us to where we want to go? Before we get into the solutions, there's something else to bring into the conversation, and that is rage. To live in the so-called United States today and to be at all aware and awake is to live in a state of rage. Several days ago, I listened as a black woman who is the CEO of a large organization in Chicago describe what she does every time she is pulled over in her car by police. Notice I didn't say if she is pulled over. I said every time she is. What she described was a process of opening her window quickly before the police even get out of their car, and then dangling her hands over the open window so they can see that she has nothing in them. We've all heard countless stories like that, and each story highlights the differences we experience in policing based on race. I have never once dangled my hands out of the window or worried about reaching for my registration. I don't worry because I can tell the officer does not perceive me as a threat. Being black or brown in this country means that for so many people, you, who are black and brown, seem to pose a threat in their minds. Bernard has shared with us before how he experiences being black in Lincoln Park. It's not an easy journey. Anyone who does not feel anger or rage when considering the systemic injustices that have been going on from the beginning of white people coming to this country is simply not paying attention or has learned how to compartmentalize. Many of us have grown up in homes or in churches that taught us not to feel anger even though we do. So we've learned to push it down, suppress it, dismiss it, question the validity of it. I would argue that rage is the only appropriate response to so many circumstances and systems and realities. It's what we do with that rage that makes the difference in ours and others' lives. Knowing that chaos and rage are different and yet not wholly unrelated, let's move into the antidotes that Dr. Moss gives us. We're not talking about doing away with chaos or rage. We're simply exploring how to have choice in and over each so that our response is one of harnessing the winds rather than fighting them to our own detriment. The first suggestion Moss offers regarding chaos and rage is to pause. That's what his story was about with his children. When we feel everything around us swirling out of control, rather than rush out the door into the storm, can we pause, take a breath, try to look at the situation from another perspective, and then proceed? We know how to do it intellectually, and yet sometimes we really do get caught up in the moment. Moss uses the example of an argument with someone out in the street. If someone speaks to you in a way that really offends you, do we escalate the argument or do we pause, consider what's happening really quickly, and then try to diffuse the situation? In the example of the 3 a.m. experience Jeanette and I had, it made all the difference when I was able to pause, consider new and different information, and then proceed. It may not come naturally to us, and it might completely depend on the situation. Chaos is easier for me to pause in than is rage. When I get angry, it is much more difficult to pause and reconsider and look at things from different angles. What about you? How skilled are you at knowing how and when to pause, to take a breath, to look around, to look up, to look from a different angle? Pausing can literally be the difference between taking or saving a life. Another antidote in Moss's experience is what Dr. King was trying to do with building the beloved community. Studying the teachings of Gandhi, Dr. King focused on Gandhi's ability to befriend his adversaries, most of whom had great admiration for Gandhi. King already knew that hating one's opponents was not just immoral, but also a self-defeating strategy because it kept up a cycle of revenge and retaliation. Only nonviolence could break the cycle and create lasting peace. In his 1957 speech titled Birth of a New Nation, Dr. King said this: "The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community. The aftermath of nonviolence is redemption. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation. The aftermath of violence is emptiness and bitterness. The ultimate goal in creating a beloved community was integration, which for King meant genuine intergroup and interpersonal living. And nonviolence was the only way to get to reconciliation. For Dr. King, freedom was the destination, and creating the beloved community was the path to get there. The core value along the way was agape love. Dr. King described agape love as understanding, redeeming goodwill for all, an overflowing love which is purely spontaneous, unmotivated, groundless, and creative. The love of God operating in the human heart. King said, agape does not begin by discriminating between worthy and unworthy people. It begins by loving others for their sakes and makes no distinction between a friend and enemy. It is directed toward both friend and enemy. Agape is love seeking to preserve and create community. As a way to create this beloved community whose core value would be agape love, Dr. King started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Otis Moss writes, in its mission statement, King's new organization committed itself to creating the beloved community in America where brotherhood, which was the language at the time, is a reality. The civil rights movement was the model for an inclusive community in which all had worth and dignity. The movement itself was the experiment that set out to show how it was done. What was begun in 1957 is still a vision of what could be. How do we get there? Dr. Moss says in his book that we need to learn spiritual navigation. Part of what he means by that goes back to consecrating the chaos and learning to pause. If we can alter the way we see something or someone, we can alter our response to it or to them. Using the examples of a basketball game, a walk through a museum where you see art you don't understand, and a situation on the street where someone talks to you in an offensive way, Dr. Moss writes, when you see the design in the confusion, when you hear the music in the noise, when you look at the blur of moving bodies on the basketball court and see the opening for your move to the basket, the event is not passive. You are the one choosing to slow the pace of your own perception and give yourself over to the confusion long enough to be taught by it, to see what could be. The reasons we are still working at this vision 66 years later are complex. The reality is we continue to struggle with what Dr. King described as genuine intergroup and interpersonal living. A full year of sermons wouldn't be enough to detail the why. For our purposes today, let's focus on Moss's idea of spiritual navigation. Whatever your particular beliefs, and I know we're all different when it comes to what we believe, what is your grounding or your foundation when we talk about spiritual navigation? How are you cultivating an inner life? By that I mean, When you're alone and aware of your own thoughts and feelings and experiences, where do you go with them? Do you have a prayer life, a reading life, a journaling life, a spiritual mentor, a partner or dear friend with whom you can share your full self? A tree or a forest or a special animal that speaks to you? God speaks to us in so many different ways, it's mind-boggling. If we can quiet ourselves and be open, maybe we will hear how to spiritually navigate these times. I want to go back to the summer of 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. This congregation put up a banner in the front yard declaring that Black Lives Matter, along with some other affirming statements. Not long after we put it up, I received an email, and the subject was Black Lives Matter, and this was part of the message. Whereas I think it appropriate to post signs decrying racism, as a fellow Christian who is a member of a Presbyterian church in another state, I'm not going to be specific, I would, with an open heart and mind, like to know why your church would post a sign reading Black Lives Matter in a font clearly the same as that of the organization that goes by that name. The tenets of that organization have included calls to defund and disband the police, and protests held by that group have led to attacks on the police and others and destruction of property. A not unreasonable assessment of the organization Black Lives Matter would conclude that its activities and pronouncements have contributed to an increase in violent crime in our cities, crimes that have resulted in the deaths of many Black Americans and children. I truly don't understand how a Christian church could willfully show support for this organization. I look forward to your response. Well, you all know me, and you know that my response was quite long, and that I asked many questions in my response. My email ended with this paragraph. Mostly, I am sad that you would wonder how a Christian church could willfully show support for Black Lives Matter. Have you written similar inquiries to churches who preached that the election of President Biden was invalid, the churches who stoked the fear and violence that led to the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol? Every Christian church that openly supported the former president is actually guilty of violence against immigrant children, against refugees seeking a safe harbor, against people of Asian or Pacific Islander descent, against Black people and brown people, as the former president touted white supremacy openly, just to name a few. I raise this question because in my mind, according to how I read Scripture, that is the far greater threat to Christianity and to loving our neighbor. Now, I was a little bit pleased with my response when I sent it, but I will say that I've learned a lot in the last couple of years. And I've mentioned to you before that part of what I've learned is that instead of trying to isolate people who aren't quite up with the movement, we've got to meet them and walk with them and bring them forward. I would probably change my response today, some of it anyway, I'll be honest. I haven't progressed that far. But I think I would change some of my response in terms of what I've learned in the last couple of years. We are 66 years into what I would call reclaiming the beloved community that Jesus began forming in his short time on earth. Jesus did ministry on the margins with the marginalized because If the followers of Jesus couldn't live with the most marginalized, the beloved community, the vision of God, would never exist. In Luke 22, Jesus chose nonviolence, even when faced with losing his life. He didn't just stop the violence, but he went on to heal the violence that had occurred. Learning to pause and recalibrate and look at situations with different perceptions is one of the tools we have in our toolbox as we seek to consecrate our chaos. Learning to harness the energy in the chaos and knowing how to redirect our rage using that energy is another one of our tools. Both of these tools come from spiritual navigation. How we learn to listen to God, however we understand God, and then move in the world accordingly. As a Christian church, as people who are actively working to dismantle supremacies of all kinds, let us continue the work of all those past and present who are also working to build the beloved community. Amen.